Welcome to OJ Studios. Please enjoy this week's short story Punished at School by Olivia Julius. Mr. Adams forced me into the principal's office and sat me in a chair facing Mrs. White's chair. Standing behind me looking miserable was Gretchen. She was covered from head to feet in blue paint. Most of it had dried on the way over to the principal's office, but she was still forced to stand in fear that she might get the paint all over the seats. Gretchen pulled at her hair in a feeble attempt to get the matted clumps of wiry curly red hair free from the dried paint. When she couldn't get it free, she sighed and I could see another tear fall from her eyes. This wasn't fair. It wasn't my idea to pour paint all over Gretchen. It was Cody's. I just following along watching him do it. The only reason that I was in here and he wasn't because Mr. Adams had spotted me while both Cody and I were running away. Mr. Anderson! I jumped when I heard Mrs. White's booming voice called my name. I looked over to where Mrs. White was taking a piece of paper from Mr. Adam. Mrs. White looked down at the note and folded it. I was all the way in the high school in a meeting with a prospective student. How do you think that makes us look? I wanted to roll my eyes. Trust me, this school is way too worried about public image. Maybe it's because it's the only private school in the city, and that it's the only school that can beat the public school's football team. Mrs. White then walked over to her desk while holding the note from Mr. Adams in a uniform. I looked at it for a second and then saw that it was girls' uniform. Mrs. Decker, here's a new uniform for you. Go to the locker room, take a shower, try to get as much paint off of you as you can, then report back to your class. Gretchen looked up from where she was sitting, nodded, and without looking at me, she grabbed the uniform from Mrs. White's desk and ran out of the office. Mrs. White then turned her attention to me. I looked at her for a second and wondered what she was going to say to me. Well, what do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Anderson? I wanted to say that I wasn't the only one that had planned this. I wanted to make an excuse for why I had done this, but my brain came up empty. Mrs. White waited for a second, sighed, and then spoke. Now in a calmer tone. You cannot and should not be throwing paint on anyone. She said, we here at Yates Prep Elementary School we must have a higher respect for our peers. Yes, ma'am. I whispered. So, one of two things is going to happen today. Mrs. White turned around to a table behind her and grabbed a pen and paper. First, I want you to write an apology letter to Ms. Decker. I perked up a little, that didn't seem so bad. And what second, I asked, taking the paper and pen from Mrs. White. Second, I see that you have a lot of paint on your uniform as well. I looked down at my slacks and saw light blue painted spots and smears all around. Mrs. White stood up and opened a cabinet and took out a uniform and put it on her desk right in front of me. I looked at the uniform for a second and then looked back up at Mrs. White. Mrs. White, this is a girl's uniform, I said, holding up the charcoal gray pleated skirt. I know, Mrs. White said, folding her arms. I don't have any boy uniforms in your size. Plus I think this will be a good thing for you too. Maybe while wearing this, you can think about your decisions. But I can't, I began to say, but Mrs. White stopped me. I already talked to your parents, they fully support me giving you this. But I'll be laughed at, I retorted. Just like you laughed at Gretchen? Mrs. White asked. Mrs. White stood up and dropped the girl's uniform on my lap. Now do I have to put this on you, or will you be a big boy and put it on yourself? I looked at her, trying to see if this was just a scare tactic or if she was really serious. After a minute standoff, Mrs. White took me by the ear and dragged me into an unused conference room. You have 5 minutes to get your new uniform on and be ready to go back to class. She shoved me in and shut the door. I dropped the uniform on the conference table and looked at it. The uniform is the normal uniform that all the girls in my school wear on a daily basis. I looked back at the door. I was stuck. If I put this on, everyone was going to laugh at me. However, if I didn't put this on, Mrs. White was going to put it on, and then everyone was going to still laugh at me. I sighed and took off my boy uniform. I couldn't believe that this was happening to me. This is so embarrassing. I put the blue polo on, noting on how it looked similar it looked to my uniform polo, but also extremely different. I then sucked in a deep breath as I took the skirt and put it on. The first thing I noticed was the open feeling to the skirt. As I walked around the room, I could feel the skirt swishing around me no matter how much I tried to pretend that it wasn't there. After taking several deep breaths, I opened the door to find Mrs. White standing there. "One more thing, Mr. Anderson, put these on," she said, pointed to the ground where a pair of girly socks and a pair of black Mary Janes. I looked at her, bleeding, but knew that I had to. Once I put them on, Mrs. White escorted me out of the office and down to my classroom. "I hope by wearing this for one day that you will learn your lesson," Mrs. White said, before adding, "Oh, by the way, any more trouble out of you and you'll be wearing that uniform for the rest of the school year."